right, everyone, I'm reading the next chapter of Global Women, Nannies, Maids, and Sex Workers in the New Economy. And this chapter is called Invisible Labors, Caring for the Independent Person by Lynn May Rivas. 20 minutes into the interview, Bill coughs. I notice that his voice is beginning to deteriorate. Earlier, he told me he had a problem with dehydrating when he talks a lot. We are in his bedroom. On the table next to him is a glass of water with a plastic top and a straw. Since he's unable to use his hands, I offer, would you like some water? Bill raises his voice and calls, Joe. Then he explains, I have an attendant. Okay, I reply. I'm disappointed because I'm asking questions about his relationship with his attendants, and I was hoping to have privacy during the interview. Bill again calls Joe. Then addressing me, he says, I'm okay. He makes still another cry of Joe, and again tells me, I'll be okay. Joe does not come. Bill's voice is loud enough to be heard in the rest of the apartment, but just barely. I think I should volunteer to look for Joe or to call him with my louder voice. But Bill's insistence that he'll be okay, coupled with his earlier refusal of my offer to hold the water glass, leaves me uncertain what to do. I do nothing. We continue the interview for another 15 minutes until Bill again calls out, Joe, Joe, hey Joe, hey Joe, hey Joe, Joe. Bill's roommate pokes his head into the room and says, I think Joe's outside. Bill says, oh, okay. Then he continues answering my questions. 30 seconds later, his roommate reappears and says, actually, I don't think he's in the house. I don't know where he's at. His roommate leaves and Bill says, Joe is really wonderful. He probably just cut out for a few minutes. We continue the interview, but I am uncomfortably aware of the fact that talking without water is causing Bill to dehydrate. Furthermore, his voice is deteriorating and he is getting harder to understand. So much so that when I review the tape for transcription, many of his responses are lost. Nevertheless, I say nothing. 10 more minutes pass before he calls again. Joe, hey Joe. Joe, are you around? By this point, I feel frantic. I can't imagine why he won't let me give him water. Do you want me to go outside and see if I could find him? I ask in desperation, not sure what I should do. Bill responds, would you? I find Joe sitting in the sun directly outside the apartment. I tell him that Bill wants him, and he explains that he was waiting for me to leave. I wonder what Joe will think when he gets to Bill's room. Will he think that I was unwilling to hold the glass of water? I want to tell Joe that I offered to give Bill the water, that I appreciate his giving us privacy, and that I am sorry to interrupt his break. I resist the impulse, however, saying nothing. I follow Joe back to Bill's room, and during the last 20 minutes of our interview, he stands next to Bill, offering him a sip of water every few minutes seamlessly. In 1999, my mother, who is a personal attendant, had to choose between caring for her seriously ill client and taking care of her own dying mother. She did not want to abandon her client. She worried that the client's family would not be able to replace her quickly enough, and she feared losing her job. I offered to step in with the client, allowing my mother to care for my grandmother. The strange experience of expressing my love for my mother and grandmother by caring for a stranger marked the beginning of my interest in personal attendant work. Though it was my first experience working as a personal attendant, it was not my last. My mother, now in her 60s, is an immigrant from Mexico with less than a high school education. Her background is typical among personal attendants. Many, if not most, personal attendants are immigrant women or women of color over the age of 40. But given that there are many differences, some personal attendants are native born while others are immigrants. Some are African Americans or other people of color. Some are white. Of the immigrants, some are sponsored by family members, some are illegal, and still others are refugees. Some have lived here for 40 years, others for 40 weeks. They come from China, Indonesia, Afghanistan, Russia, various Latin American countries, and elsewhere. For some, this job is a one-generation stopover. Their mothers were not personal attendants, nor will their daughters be. For others, it was the work of their mothers and grandmothers, and it will be the work of their daughters as well. Some have professional degrees but poor English, having fled countries racked by civil wars. Others grew up in poverty and have only high school degrees. What they share is that they are mostly women, and they are overwhelmingly poor. Bill was one of the 21 subjects I interviewed between 1999 and 2001, among them 11 personal attendants, 2 former personal attendants, and 8 people with disabilities who used personal attendants. The attendants in my sample fell into 2 categories. One, made up of immigrant women and women of color, is not too different from the larger population of such workers. The other group is more anomalous, encompassing workers who are mostly white, have had some college, and include some men, such as Joe. The consumers in my sample have also had some college. They are all white, severely disabled, and of working age. Personal attendants care for people with a range of disabilities who need assistance with daily living. Attendants may be required to prepare meals, shop, assist with baths, or provide bowel and bladder care. Without attendant care, many people with disabilities would be confined to institutions. Most of them do not need care from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Rather, particularly for people considered severely disabled, care must be spaced throughout the day. The consumer who needs help getting out of bed, as well as getting bathed and dressed, may need his or her personal attendant to work a brief morning shift that can range from 1 to 4 hours. Someone who needs help eating will require another 1 or 2 shifts during the day. Another shift will be required to help the consumer get into bed at night. These shifts may be filled by one personal attendant or, more commonly, by several. The number of attendants involved in the care of one individual can become so large and the turnover rate so high that over a lifetime a single consumer will employ literally hundreds of people. One of my interviews, who had needed attendant services for 20 years and at the time of the interview employed 7 people, exclaimed, "I'm like a company. It's exhausting, but every crip on the block is a company." Although many consumers may feel like small corporations, most do not have the resources of small corporations. In fact, most consumers of personal attendant services meet the low-income qualifications required for those services to be paid by the government. The state, however, is willing to pay little more than minimum wage, and so consumers with limited financial means are left to hire people, usually immigrant women and women of color, who will work for very little. Nevertheless, due to extraordinary growth projections, employment trend analysts celebrate the opportunities available in personal attendant work. Some even call it one of the hot jobs of the new millennium. Advocates of personal attendant services also insist that these jobs are good first steps for immigrants, and that they can lead to other opportunities, though it is not clear of what kind. It's true that many immigrant women work as personal attendants as their first jobs, but the women who take these jobs then work in a private household where they are socially isolated with little potential for collective voice and few prospects for job mobility. There is no formal training, no career ladder, and no hope for advancement. Speaking through an interpreter, one immigrant woman who lived with the elderly disabled couple she cared for bemoaned her lack of opportunities. "The worst part is that even though I have completed my studies in my country, I have not even been able to complete a 1-year language course in this country. I want to improve my language skills, but because these people need someone to be with them 24 hours a day, and because they speak my own language, I can't improve my English with them." Personal attendants rarely receive health benefits, vacation time, or sick leave. They can be fired at will without notice. Their work hours make it difficult for them to get 40 hours of work a week with any one client, but traveling among various different employers consumes a significant amount of unpaid time. Taking travel time and expense into account, many of these jobs actually net less than the minimum wage. Given the striking lack of opportunity this job provides, it is not surprising that the demand for personal attendant services is met largely by one of the most vulnerable populations of workers, immigrant women. The low status and social invisibility of immigrant women allows them more easily to achieve the invisibility required for the job. This social invisibility is necessary because personal attendants are essential to the home care consumers' identities as independent individuals. Said one consumer of personal attendant services, "When I was a kid, my parents, they were doing all the stuff that I do now. When I turned 12 or 13, they hired someone to be there with me, help me with my homework and that kind of stuff, so I was slowly getting a taste of independence, but I was still living with my parents." No longer living with his parents, this consumer considers himself independent. But being independent not only means living apart from his parents, more important, it means not having them care for him. The fact that he believed he got a taste of independence as a 13-year-old when his parents paid to have an attendant care for him demonstrates that his sense of independence does not rest on his ability to pay for his own care. Rather, it rests simply on the fact that his care is somebody's paid work. Indeed, although their work may appear identical, paid caregivers deliver a different cultural good than family members or friends can provide. Personal attendants deliver the illusion of independence. American individualism stresses personal independence and autonomy in all its aspects. The archetypal account of self-reliance is Henry David Thoreau's Walden. But although Thoreau appeared to have a completely independent day-to-day existence, he came to Walden with a history and with resources. He neither built his home without a hammer nor learned to fish by himself. The nurturing he received as a child allowed him to achieve the robust physical condition he called upon in his times of isolation. Indeed, when we think of all the objects, beliefs, and interactions that make our lives possible, it is difficult to sustain the notion that anyone is self-made. Nevertheless, the idea of the self-reliant, independent man occupies the center of the American imagination. Its persistence as one of our dominant cultural ideals lends it the power to obscure the actual interdependent state of our lives. Maria, a personal attendant from Mexico, observed, "I think that American society values independence. If an elderly person lives alone, I think that's when they say, she's independent, she's strong. If she's living with somebody, I think that's when they say, gosh, she's not able to take care of herself." And I think there is a big stigma if you can't stand up on your own feet. I think people lose status because they only respect the strong. In American society, rights, respect, and status depend on one's ability to present oneself as independent. Joan Tronto points out that we prefer to ignore routine forms of care because they threaten our autonomy. For disabled individuals, this often means minimizing the visibility of the paid care that facilitates a disabled person's daily life. The best care workers, according to some consumers in attendance, are those whose presence is barely felt. One immigrant care worker described when he considers quality care, "It's being able to put yourself in a situation where you are almost not seen, where the recipient of care is so able to do what he wants, it almost feels like I'm doing this and you're not even in the picture in his mind. When he's so in tune with what he's doing, what he wants to do, and feels really good, and you're almost non-existent, and yet you're there. It's like you're there, but you're not there. When they can do something without even realize that they're doing it because you're there, that's quality work right there." For all that, however, personal attendant work consists of literal physical acts, things one can see and touch. How can that labor be transformed into something unseen? In fact, what is made invisible is not the labor itself, but the worker. When the workers are invisible, consumers can feel that they have accomplished their daily activities by themselves. Independence, after all, is not a simply passive state. It is something people do. Personal attendants, beyond performing caregiving tasks, participate in creating an illusion of independence for the disabled individuals they serve. Together with the consumers of their services, personal attendants accomplish this by transferring the authorship of many caregiving tasks from the worker to the consumer. This is a collaborative process through which not one but two identities are constructed. Care receivers are constructed as independent, and caregivers are constructed as invisible. Women and members of certain ethnic groups are often thought to be natural caregivers. Not surprisingly, the consumers I interviewed claimed that workers who were mothers or who came from foreign countries, bearing, as Ron asserted, old world values, made the best caregivers. One consumer, Janet, offered that foreign people stick around longer and unfortunately they take better care. Another, Sue, averred that immigrants just care a lot more and have much more of a helping attitude than, let's say, an American. George, a self-described consumer advocate, agreed, noting that some feel the best workers are illegal immigrants. Immigrant women are easily cast into roles that require invisibility because they already belong to a category that is socially invisible. Furthermore, when care activities are naturalized and essentialized, the work they entail is effectively erased. Immigrant women are the caregivers par excellence because both they and their work are often rendered invisible. What's more, caregivers often actively participate in this erasure. Davian, a woman of color who works as an attendant, says it is important for personal attendants to do the work like they really want to. When the effort of care turns into something the worker wants to do, the labor vanishes. Nonetheless, care workers and their work are made invisible by a range of factors, including the work itself, the worker's social characteristics and roles, and the degree to which the work does or does not conflict with those roles or characteristics. Care work is considered women's work, and as a general rule, it is undervalued. As one personal attendant observed, you can make more washing a dog than you can washing a human being. Associated with bodily functions, care work can also be considered humiliating or degrading. Part of the worker's job is to exhibit an absence of disgust. Receivers of care, too, may find the arrangement humiliating. Needing help with bodily functions can be particularly shame-provoking for adults. One consumer told me, if they're moms, it's easy because they're used to diapers. That's the worst part for people, is dealing with the bowel movement. Because I need help with that too. What I usually say is, pretend you're changing a diaper and they usually cope pretty well. I asked this consumer how it felt to know that the workers had to cope. The consumer replied, in the beginning it was one of the hardest things in the world, but now it's part of living. The attendant's job, therefore, is to reduce the amount of shame the consumer feels, first of all, by not showing disgust. In a study that compared the care provided by paid caregivers to the care provided by family members, Lise Isaacson found that the care related to stressful emotions such as tasks involving bodily functions requires distance. Paid strangers are able to deliver care in a way that is less shaming for the receiver. Women workers are further enabled to do this kind of work invisibly because it is similar to work like changing diapers, which is considered a part of the female gender role. And what makes the uncomfortable intimacy of the attendant's job comfortable is the attendant's invisibility. After all, a disabled receiver of care cannot retreat to another room for privacy, as an employer of a domestic worker might. Rather, his or her body is central to the attendant's work. "I'm like an extension of his body," said Julie, an attendant. For the consumer, this results in a loss of privacy. For the home care worker, it produces another kind of burden, as he or she must constantly manage his or her emotions. One consumer responding to my question about the lack of privacy said, "Sometimes you just have to say, 'I really need to take a nap. Don't talk to me for a half hour or something.'" When I spoke with attendants, the obligation to manage their emotions emerged as the most oppressive aspect of the job. Ironically, this emotional labor is not recognized as work. Rather, it is invisible. Invisibility and the transfer of the authorship of one's efforts to another person requires the desire, at least the consent of the caregiver, not to be seen. Caregivers hand over authorship of their caring work. This is not to say that receivers share no responsibility for this situation. Rebecca, for example, expressed a desire for the care she receives to be done without effort, or, in other words, to be done invisibly. Quality care is when that attendant has left. I feel good. I feel refreshed, clean, sitting in my chair correctly. I have everything I need for the day, and I have an attendant who has come in and done it effortlessly. Another consumer, who has an attendant assist him at work, uses language to take authorship of his attendant's activities. "I'm running around the office, sending out faxes, photocopying, laser beaming, that kind of stuff," he recounts, although he is not physically able to carry out any of those activities. The degree to which care workers participate in their own invisibility varies. Only one attendant in my sample explicitly envisioned quality care as requiring invisibility. Others tended to define quality care as involving a kind of intense focus on the care receiver. Elisa, an immigrant worker, is proud of the fact that she knows what her employer's needs are even before those needs are articulated. When they are looking towards something or even moving their lips, I know what they needed. Immediately, I provided them with water, tea, food. There is, however, no reciprocal gaze on the caregiver. It can be argued that the disabled employer's bodily needs are so great that this focus is justified. But one must not underestimate the needs of the caregiver, which are not as obviously embodied, but may nevertheless be great. Personal attendants are often new immigrants, unfamiliar with the customs, norms, laws, and language of their adopted country. Some face additional struggles because they are undocumented. Working in a largely unregulated occupation, personal attendants are especially vulnerable to racism, sexism, sexual harassment, and taxing work conditions. Poor to begin with, these workers tend to be badly compensated. And when they're women, their care workload generally extends beyond their clients to their families. Often they have no one to take over their care responsibilities or to help them when they need care themselves. These workers are also vulnerable in that they must constantly struggle for respect. Every time a worker was present in the course of my interviews, sometimes coming within a few feet of me for a brief interaction with the consumer failed to introduce us. This is particularly striking given that the subject of the interview was the relationship between caregivers and care receivers. None of the caregivers I observed at consumers' homes introduced themselves, and it was difficult to make eye contact with them in order to introduce myself. By failing to make eye contact, the attendants reinforced and helped produce the invisibility that caused the consumers not to introduce them in the first place. If we accept the view that the invisibility of personal attendants is particularly demeaning and oppressive, how do we make sense of the idea that personal attendants consent to their invisibility? First of all, not all workers who consent to being invisible desire it. When someone implied that one of my interviewees didn't need to be introduced at a meeting because he was just the caregiver commented, "It does hurt, you know." Some attendants do desire invisibility. Since their job is to confer independence, it makes sense that workers who want to do a good job will participate in making themselves invisible. They will be further motivated if they care about their employers. Ironically, handing over the authorship of caring labor may itself be the most caring part of care. Are workers who articulate a desire to be invisible oppressed by being made so? Must one feel oppressed to be oppressed? I believe that the transfer of authorship is a negative phenomenon even for those who can consciously work to make it happen. To be made invisible is the first step toward being considered non-human, which is why making another person invisible often precedes treating them inhumanely. To use Marxist terms, invisibility is the most extreme form of alienation, the ultimate manifestation of self-estrangement. In the traditional capitalist worker transaction, what is appropriated is surplus value. Here, however, what is produced is the activity of care work, and so it is the authorship of this activity that may be appropriated. The personal attendants I interviewed recognized and resented the fact that they were unseen and undervalued. One attendant observed, "We should be respected as hardworking people, as doing a hard job, but how much respect have we gotten in history books?" These personal attendants want it both ways. They want to be valued and recognized as important people, yet they also want to help the consumer feel independent, which means that they must transfer the authorship of their actions and make themselves invisible. Interestingly, the attendants do not connect their invisibility in relation to the consumer to their invisibility in relation to the larger society. That many personal attendants fail to see their participation in the transfer of authorship as problematic is not surprising. In a culture like ours, few individuals embrace dependence or interdependence. The attendant may want to do care work in a visible, self-affirming way that neither negates his or her own contribution, nor conceals the dependence of the person being cared for. But he or she is often faced with a recipient who experiences being cared for as a painful reminder of dependence. Under these circumstances, workers may feel compelled to hide the true nature of care. Once the worker makes this choice, the necessary result is that he or she will be undervalued for the work. How could something unseen be completely valued? Some will argue that individuals whose job it is to be invisible are valued for their very invisibility. But the jobs of invisible people are the lowest paid, and this low pay reflects the value such workers possess in the eyes not only of society, but of the people for whom they are caring. One consumer, George, questioned my use of the term caregiver. He said, "Caregiver? That's a controversial term. Say personal attendant instead." George was referring to a controversy within the disabled community regarding the role of personal attendants and their relationships with consumers of care. Informing this debate is the disability community's history with care that imprisoned them in institutions, made them the victims of caregiving professionals, or left them at the mercy of abusive or controlling familial relationships. Consumers who reject the word care see it as implying too much passivity on the part of the care receiver. Others embrace an idea of caregiving in which receivers recognize their dependence on their personal attendants and understand that personal attendants can also fulfill emotional needs. Most of the consumers I interviewed considered business-like relationships with their personal attendants to be ideal. Interestingly, however, this expectation directly conflicts with what the attendants felt was the most essential quality for their jobs. Maria explained, "Of course they need to have their basics. The house needs to be cleaned, they need to eat, they need to shower, that kind of thing. But I think that it goes beyond that. You have to show that you care. You have to show that you care. Because they're not objects, and it's not just a job, you know. You get attached. You're working with human beings, and that's where the difference lies, between working with people and working with things. They also need to feel like they're still humans who deserve respect, love, and care." Jacob, another attendant, agreed. "I enjoy the atmosphere and conversation I create with whoever it is that I'm with, and there really isn't much that happens besides that. All the physical tasks are incidental. I think the most important thing in the relationship is that the attendant like the consumer. The absence of a business-like relationship creates an opportunity for the attendant to like the employer more." The attendants I interviewed described their work almost as a religious calling. Muhammad, who acted as a translator in my interview with his wife, told me, "She is doing these things for the satisfaction of our conscience, of our spirituality." Working as a personal attendant is a labor of love. Money changes hands, but this is not commodified care. The immigrant women and women of color in my sample unanimously said that good care required that they love the receiver. Patting her chest, Davian told me, "It has to come from here. You just got to have that love." Nothing brought attendants more satisfaction than when care receivers loved them back. In other words, the ideal employment situation was not one where they were thinking only about the consumer, but one in which the consumer also thought about them. These were relationships that seemed more familial than businesslike. Cecilia asserted, "I like to work as a home healthcare worker better than in a nursing home, because when you go to their house, it is as if you're going to care for a relative, a family member." Maria, reflecting on the elderly woman now deceased for whom she used to care, said, "We became really good friends. I loved her like a grandmother." The consumers I interviewed, however, including those who were close to their attendants, expressed a desire for a different kind of relationship. Rebecca echoed many of their sentiments when she said, "I tend to like to put up a wall with my attendants." That care receivers are not particularly open to more personal relationships with their caregivers is not surprising, since these jobs pay so poorly that few caregivers tend to stay in them for long. Given the expectation of high turnover, consumers I interviewed expected their attendants to do little more than accomplish discrete tasks. In the past, family members supplied the intimate bodily care that is now performed by personal attendants. The care provided by personal attendants is public care. It is paid and performed by non-kin, albeit in the domestic spheres. Deborah Stone cautions, when we stop doing care and instead hire someone else to do it, the care becomes commodified, and we look at other people as means, not ends. When care is commodified, the care receiver becomes an independent purchaser of services to which he or she feels entitled. The care receiver does not experience the caregiver as generously expressing affection and concern through his or her work. Rather, the worker is simply doing a paid job. When I asked him what his caregiver had done that was above and beyond the call of duty, Ron replied, "I can't think of a good answer to that. I don't know of anything that I ask of them that isn't what I consider to be part of the attendant's job." Several of the consumers I interviewed responded similarly. At first, I thought these answers reflected on the care workers in question. But upon further questioning, I realized that this was not a personal assessment of their attendant so much as a structural assessment. The consumers felt that they had fully purchased the time of their personal attendant. Therefore, there was nothing the attendant did within his or her work time that the consumer did not consider part of the job. When the job expands to include everything the attendant does, it becomes impossible for the caregiver to express real caring because nothing he or she does is understood as a gift. On the other hand, it's no wonder that disabled consumers want to distance their bodily needs from their personal relationships. Some of the disabled individuals I interviewed involve their friends in their personal care, but most are very careful to draw a line. One consumer explained, "I really try to keep that to a minimum because that really does cut into the friendships. Those who do rely on friends to provide care often see their friendships suffer as a result." One interviewee told of a friendship that ruptured under the strain of her care needs. She lost not only a friend, but also the person who was meeting her important needs. What would it be like to live in a society where the need for care and the work of care were supported materially and symbolically? Maybe in such a society, we wouldn't mind when our friends cared for us, and our friends wouldn't find caring for us a burden. The state wouldn't enfranchise disabled consumers to choose the best person for the job. Dependents would not be stigmatized. Under these conditions, consumers and personal attendants could meet each other as equals, forging a mutually respectful relationship that would transcend commodification. Conclusion. As a Latina woman, I would under many circumstances have no difficulty being invisible enough to provide good care. However, as the anecdote at the beginning of the paper illustrates, in my role as a researcher for the University of California, I was not a preferred provider of a certain type of care. Bill could not tolerate my assistance with the glass of water because I was not sufficiently invisible to perform such intimate care. Had I helped Bill drink, he would not have been able to maintain an image of himself as independent. But when his paid caregiver raised the cup to his lips, the act was invisible. In other words, the very same work is either visible or invisible, depending upon who does it. Furthermore, not all care work requires the same level of invisibility. Physical, intimate types of care work, for example, require the most invisibility on the part of the caregiver. Bill allowed me to get his attendant because this fell within the range of activities not likely to stigmatize the beneficiary as dependent. On the other hand, the fact that he was not comfortable asking me to get his attendant, and that I had to offer, could mean that even this gesture threatened his sense of autonomy. We are all dependent on others to varying degrees. A language that denies this fact fuels a system that obscures the ways in which other people care for us. Words such as independence, self-reliance, and self-made help create and are created by a dynamic within which people are ignored and devalued. Joan Tronto reminds us that by not noticing how pervasive and central care is to human life, those who are in positions of power and privilege can continue to ignore and degrade the activities of care and those who gave care. Independence is perhaps the most fundamental of our cultural myths. It supports the organization of our society and justifies the distribution of goods, real and ideal. The labels independent and dependent, rather than reflecting empirical reality, are myths used to justify inequality. The transfer of authorship of tasks is ubiquitous in American society. It occurs between executives and secretaries, between children and mothers, between disabled individuals and their caregivers. Nevertheless, two things are true. No one is invisible and no one is independent. If we recognize our dependence on others, we must acknowledge that we fall short of the cultural ideal of independence. We must further acknowledge our debt to those upon whom we depend. When individuals with care needs have to worry about whether or not their caregiver will come the next morning, Perhaps it is simply too frightening for them to face the extent of their dependency. Rejecting care because of its connection to dependence and embracing a business-like commodified relationship in which the receiver becomes a consumer, disabled people can nurture the illusion of choice and control. However, without the resources to pay competitive wages, and most of these care receivers have few options regarding who will care for them or how much they will receive. Furthermore, in a strictly commodified relationship, caregivers and care receivers become means instead of ends, a dynamic that denies the full subjectivity of both. Consumers of personal attendant services deserve good care, delivered by people they can rely on. Personal attendants deserve reasonable wages, decent working conditions, and to have their efforts recognized. Both parties deserve arrangements that hold out the possibility for mutual respect and love for relationship and community. The fact that some people need more assistance than others should affect the larger polity more than it does. Rather, the workers and their efforts are not the only invisible parties. The disabled population and its needs are invisible as well. All of us need to take responsibility for the caring needs of our society. We need to reject claims of independence when they legitimate the unequal distributions of rights and resources. We need to recognize that independence is a fantasy, not just for disabled individuals, but for everyone. And that is the end of that chapter. So thank you for joining me. Bye.